Welcome to this webinar with Axiomatics. My name is actually Finn Frisch. I will do a brief intro and then I will hand over to my colleague Sridit Nair, who will do the presentation today. For today, the agenda is about our developer program and the new product, the Developer Edition of Axiomatics Policy Server. So a few things to this. We will talk briefly about the company for those who are not familiar with Axiomatics. Then we'll do a common authorization, a common background on authorization patterns. We'll talk about externalizing authorization, quick overview of XACML to those who are not familiar with it, and then dive into the APS Developer Edition, do an introduction of that and a demo, and finally we have the questions and answers. So, about Axiomatics. Axiomatics is a company focusing strongly on the XACML standard and externalized authorization solutions. The company was founded in 2006 but has a very much longer background in this field. We've been doing R&D since 2000 around the XACML standard. The company is a very active member of the OASIS XACML Technical Committee, and the company has editorial responsibilities since 2005 within this technical committee. The CTO of Axiomatics is actually the editor of the committee. Products that Axiomatics produce are conforming with XACML 2.0 and 3.0, and we have some of the largest XACML deployments worldwide. So, the reason for this webinar, from our point of view, is it's driven a bit by the fact that we recently launched our new developer edition of the Axiomatics Policy Server product. This edition comes with a license that limits it to non-production use. The main focus here is to reduce the lead time for developers to start using XACML and to enable developers to easily use XACML in their applications. So if you're interested in this special edition that is targeting developers, contact Axiomatics Sales. Now, at the same time, it may be worth noting that this is the first targeted edition of the Axiomatics Policy Server. More will follow. We will have an express edition of this product that comes up later on this year. And with this, I will hand over to Sridit Nair, who is the head of the Developer Relations Program at Axiomatics. So, Sridit, are you with me?
Yes, Finn, I am. Thank you for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. So, as Finn mentioned, we are going to discuss the topic of preparing your application for externalized authorization within this webinar. The webinar is kind of arranged such that there are two main parts. The first one where we introduce the whole concept of authorization, externalized authorization, XACML, and programmatic models. And the second part where we look at APS Developer Edition and give you a demo of what is in there and what can be used by developers. So to get the whole rolling.
So, Sridit, sorry, just a second. We have people reporting that it's a bit difficult to hear you. So could you come closer to the microphone?
Sure. Is that better?
Yes. Good. Thank you.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Right. So in the good old days where life was easy and simpler, authorization was just about who you are. Authenticate yourself and you get a lot of things, and you don't have to do a lot more other process at the back end. But given the fact that IT processes and networks and everything has evolved to a point of complexity, authorization should really be about a whole lot of other things, including who, what, when, where, why, and how. And authorization decisions need to be made based on taking into account a lot of these factors. So if you look at historically speaking, the authorization approaches have had its fair of models, the main of which, for example, have been access control lists, where you have resources being the centric, or the objects being the center of the whole model. Permissions are attached to these objects, and then you specify which of the subjects have access to these objects within the permissions. So those are the access control list models. And then you have the traditional role-based access control models, RBAC in short, where you have users who are given one or more roles, and each of these roles are given one or more permissions. So they are, as one could expect, user-centric, widely adopted and well understood. There is a whole lot of industry behind it in terms of standards, best practices, guidances, and so on. It is simple, which is one of the reasons why it is actually used widely. But at the same time, because of the simplicity, it comes with some problems, which we enumerate here. So it is static and predefined and in some ways inflexible in terms of how much you can change, how fast you can change based on changing requirements, the complexity associated with change management. It doesn't extend beyond the concept of the user. The user is centric and central to the whole concept of RBAC. And it doesn't scale because of this problem of role-based, role explosion, wherein which you have to create more and more roles just to meet certain specific roles. At the end of the day, you have so many roles that it becomes harder to manage, track, audit, and handle them properly. And of course, if last but not the least, you have the problem that you can't define a lot of fine-grained access control rules within RBAC. For example, how would you implement a rule which says doctors should be able to view the records of the patients assigned to their units, say in a hospital, while at the same time be able to edit the records of these patients which they have care relationship? Now, this is a common rule you would expect in a hospital, but it's easy to know who the role is. It's a doctor, because if the doctor is centric to that role. But what's a patient? How do you capture the property of a patient and how it influences the role? What is a record? What is a care relationship? So RBAC is wanting in these kind of roles implementation. So what if we are not limited by roles? And what if we can extend beyond roles? And let's take the highlighter and mark some of these key points within the rule that we just saw. For example, the doctor, the view, records, patients, and so on. What you see here, these are all attributes, and attributes. They all are attributes which define the property of entities within that rule. So if you look at attribute-based access control, which is the key point that we are driving within this webinar and XACML work, attributes are a set of labels or properties which describe all the aspects of entities who are involved in that authorization process. And attribute-based access control uses these attributes as building blocks within its model and to form a structured language which can define both the access control rules as well as to describe the access control request. So you use attributes to define your rules, you use attributes to describe your access request. So what you see here is that when you use attributes at the core of your access control model, what used to be static and predefined in terms of RBAC models becomes dynamic and adaptive from an attribute-based access control model. So you have policies which are attributes, you have actions and which are described as attributes, and these attributes kindly basically reflect or capture the properties of generally 4 categories of entities: the user, the action, the resource, or the object, and the context of the environment that is being operated on. So from a programmatic point of view, at the same time, you have 2 different models or way of thinking about authorization, which is declarative and programmatic way of declaring using authorization. Now, in declarative form of authorization, the security roles and the constraints are added to the deployment descriptor of the application. So, for example, in J2EE, you add the web constraints in web.xml, while in EJB, you add it in EJB.xml. They are configured during assembly stage and enforced by security runtime. And again, they are centered around roles. While at the same time, in the programmatic authorization concept, you basically try and enforce your authorization within the code. So you try and write your rules and policies and what to do when you have to decide a permit or a deny and so on within your code. While it gives application developers more control, it at the same time increases the responsibility and the hard part of having to change them as and when the business policies change, the regulations change, and so on. So this is where you see the concept of externalizing authorization comes into play and why it's beneficial. What if we could externalize this authorization to a service, be it a web service or embedded service or whatever, and then use that? Our goal as Axiomatics as a company and using our products is to enable you who is using declarative programming or declarative methods of authorization, programmatic method of authorization to use our products and use the XACML standard to do your authorization external to the application. So one of the examples you can think of is the JAC interface, so the Java authorization contract for containers could be extended to make calls to external authorization providers, which clicks in very well with the concept of externalizing authorization. So from the point of view of how we see an authorization system being made future-proof so that it can withstand the test of time, we see four main pillars which help with the process. The first is to make the authorization system handle fine-grained rules, make it fine-grained enabled. And the second one is to make it context-aware so that it can understand things which is about the environment and about the context in which the authorization happens. And these two are covered in the attribute-based access control model. And the third pillar is the one we just mentioned, which is to externalize the authorization from the application, so it's externalized authorization. And fourth, last but not the least, to make it use standard compliant models so that as and when the market changes, you can move with the market in terms of needs. You can interoperate with between vendors in terms of functionality, system integration, and so on. So that nicely goes to the point of this first part of the webinar, which is on externalizing authorization. So if it's not been obvious so far, the main needs for externalizing authorization are the fact that you consider distributed or multi-tiered applications, you have to consider service-oriented architectures and cloud services, and you see that authorization needs to be done at several tiers in several places. And as a programmer, you would obviously think, the more I need to do something in several places, the obvious thing to do is, of course, to move the several often used authorization code to its own layer. And that doesn't mean you're still externalizing it, you're just making it the whole abstraction into its own layer. And that has been done, and there has been some progress. But the way it's been done so far is using different programming patterns, frameworks which provide coarse-grained authorization, and the fine-grained authorization still remains in the code without being abstracted away. So to give you an idea of the authorization frameworks that's out there, you can start from Spring Security, Microsoft Claims, Slim for PHP, Flask Auth, and Python Fedora. Of course, there are lots of these authorization frameworks out there, and which makes it, the externalization a bit more easier. But the problem with them is that most of them are specific to their language. So if you are an enterprise which uses multiple languages, you have to work so much more. They are not standard-based other than the best practices within the community of that language. The abilities are at times limited in terms of expressing and deciding on policies and how fine-grained they are. They require subject matter expertise in multiple language if you are a multiple language enterprise, and they are expensive to develop, maintain, and so on. Now, of course, the pros are that it is still a right step towards the whole concept of fine-grained authorization, and also the right step towards externalizing authorization. So this is a good place to introduce XACML, the standard, for those who don't know. It stands for Access Control Markup Language.
Sorry, Sridhar, we get reports that people, again, had a bit difficulties with the audio. So could you just come a bit closer to the microphone? Very good. Thank you.
Sure. Sure, Finn. Thanks for reporting that. So XACML, what exactly is XACML? XACML stands for Extensible Access Control Markup Language. It's a prominent ABAC system. It's an OASIS standard, the version 1 of which was approved about 10 years ago in 2003, and the latest version 3.0 was approved in the Jan of this year. So you can see that it has withstood the test of time, and it is also an active community where things are developing and new changes are and requirements are being absorbed and worked on. XACML is expressed as a specification document, and for the developers within the webinar attendees, we are working also on the JSON and the REST profiles, which we hope to become publicly available soon. The URL for the actual committee which works on XACML is over there. And quickly running through the whole concept of XACML, there are three big points regarding XACML as a standard. This first is the fact that it defines an architecture. So suppose you're a user and you want to send a request to to access a resource. The policy enforcement point, or the PEP, intercepts this request for the resource and sends it off to the PDP, which is a policy decision point. Now, the PDP can read policies from the policy retrieval point where the policies are stored. It could be a repository, it could be a file system or whatever. And it also uses the PIP, the policy information point, to gather more attributes and more information regarding the things which are already there in the access request. And of course, last but not least, you have the PAP, the policy administration point, which is used to administer, write, change, manage, decommission the policies which are used by the PDP. So from a flow point of view, suppose you are a user, you have suppose there is a user who wants to access document 1, 2, 3, let's say read. Now the PEP intercepts that and asks the PDP, can Alice access document 1, 2, 3? The PDP can then look at the PIP and find out, first it of course loads the XACML policy, and then it finds out the user's role, the clearance, and the document classification based on which it decides. For example, if you have a clearance which is higher than the document classification, you can't access the document. And this decision is sent back to the PEP, which enforces the decision by forwarding, in this case, the access request to the resource. So that's the architecture for you. Second is the policy language, which defines an XML-based policy language which have three basic structural elements: the policy set, the policy, and the rules. So root of a XACML policy is either a policy set or a policy. Within this policy set, you can have more policy sets or policies. And each of these policies can contain in itself one or more rules. And the rules basically define, contain an effect, a permitted or denied. So it could be that if this, the effect is denied. And you also have combining algorithm, which helps you define how would the precedence of rules, if there are multiple rules, or precedence of policies, if there are multiple policies, when you're evaluating that specific rules policy set. So if you just look at this tree structure of a sample segment policy, you have the root policy set, which contains internal policy sets and policies. Each of these policies can have one or more policies, which have rules, which have defining an effect, a permit or a deny. And if we just look at one stringle structure and look at what we call the Russian doll way of organizing the structures, you have the policy set, which contains targets and obligations, and then the policy, which also contains targets and obligations, and the rules, which contains, just like the other two, targets, obligations, and conditions. Now, targets define what is this policy or rule targeted at. Is it user is equal to manager, or it could be resource is equal to document 1, 2, 3, whatever. And the obligation and the conditions are extra conditions which you specify in the rules, which define how do you evaluate that specific XACML policy rule. And you have obligations and advice, which define what a PEP needs to do or can, if possible, do when responses received from the PDP. And last but not the least, the XACML standard defines the request response protocol. as I said before, the XACML policies are written in terms of attributes of 4 major categories: subject, action, resource, and environment. So policies are composed of that. And similarly, you have XACML requests being composed of subject, action, resource, and environment. And as we said before, you have the XACML request being sent from the PEP to the PDP. The PDP makes a decision, sends back the XACML response. And all of these are expressed in terms of XML as a language. Now, let's just dwell a bit more into the PEP side of things, because PEP is important from a developer point of view, because if you are an application developer, you interact with the PEP most of the time. Or if you are a PEP developer, you interact and write those PEPs. So if you have an access request, the first thing the PEP does is stop that request. It then analyzes the request and sees what are the things which are inside that request. It then forwards that request to the PDP and then enforces the decision that the PDP sends back as a XACML request. Let's just take each one of them individually and see what happens there. So let's stop the message first and see what are you trying to protect? What is the architecture that you are actually protecting, and what framework are you using? Is it J2EE? Are you protecting a web server app, in which case you could go for a servlet filter PEP? Are you protecting a web service, in which case you have a JAX-WS PEP? An enterprise service bus, an Apache service mix interceptors can be implemented. If you're using IaaS, you have the ICPI filters. And XML gateways, you can have custom vendor assertions or plugins that you can use to implement your PEP. Now, once you stop the message, you analyze and find out what are the native attributes which are within that request, and you translate that into XACML attributes. In general, there are 2 basic types of attributes: those which are already present in the message. So, for example, the HTTP method, the target URI, the SOAP action, and then, of course, you have the message payload. For example, the transaction amount, which is contained within the payload. And then you have attributes which are present as a part of environment and the framework. For example, the time of the day. And these are captured and put into a XACML request. So an example of what this is as follows. So you have the post, HTTP post, which is the message which is intercepted, and it contains a payload says user ID is equal to Joe. Now, once you transform that into a XACML request, it's a bit like this. So you have the action ID as post, and you have the resource as login.jsp, which is the thing that it is protecting here. And then you have the subject ID as Joe, which is basically the user ID that you have it here. So that is a translation that is done once you analyze the message. And then you forward it to the PDP. Of course, the PDP as such can be exposed in multiple ways. It could be an in-process PDP. It could be an RMI-based PDP, a JSON PDP, a SOAP interface-based PDP, and so on. So you need to write your PEP based on which kind of PDP you are talking to. You create a XACML request and then insert it into the transporter. So a Java XACML request could pass through an API method. It could be serialized using RMI. A JSON payload, for example, could be sent as a HTTPS request. And the XML XACML request could be within a SOAP message and sent as a HTTP request. So once you get back a decision from the PDP, you get back either a permit, deny, not applicable, or indeterminate. Not applicable happens when none of the rules and policies that you have defined within the PDP actually applies to this request. And then indeterminate happens when you don't provide enough information to the PDP to make a decision. At the PEP side, you can define your PEP bias to see what to do if you get anything other than a permit or a deny request, and then decide based on that what to do. Obligations and advices are 2 things which we mentioned before, which is part of the XACML standard. What it says is obligations have to be enforced at the PEP before the access is granted if it's the permit, while advices are things which it's good to implement, but it's not mandatory. For example, you could log the access in a central log repository. You could send in a notification email, or you could filter out some data from the response. So if you have a whole set of data from the response, you could filter some part of it, and that's part of a post obligation that we are looking at. So With that, we come to the end of the first part of the webinar, where we describe and introduce the concept of ABAC, why it's needed, the whole concept of XACML, the architecture, the language, and the request response protocol. And from a purely developer point of view, what needs to be considered when you are externalizing authorization from a XACML point of view. How do you write PEPs? What are the key things that you need to do when you're writing PEPs or interacting with PEPs? So with that in mind, let's go to the second part of the webinar, which is actually about the APS Developer Edition that Finn mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. It is an aggregate product of Axiomatics, which aims to simplify the process of working with Axiomatic process. So it's primarily intended at developers, and you will see why, and is designed to enable a quick and easy setup of APS in a non-production environment. And it's key to know it's a non-production environment because the licenses are for non-production usually, and we don't cater to things like load balancing and failover and high availability and so on in the Developer Edition. The idea being you have a complete, self-contained and easy to install package of the APS that you can quickly start with and start writing policies or your PEPs and trying things out. So what does it contain? At core of it, it contains the Axiomatics Policy Server components, the Axiomatics Services Manager, the ASM, the Axiomatics PDP, and the Axiomatics Policy Administration Point Client. It also contains the Axiomatics PEP SDK for Java and an alpha package. For those who don't know, alpha package is an Eclipse plugin that's available for you to help write XACML policies from a more programmatic, a developer-oriented point of view as a meta language. You also package in the distribution a sample demo application with a sample XACML policy already implemented in it, which means it becomes easier for you to tinker with the application and see the effect within the policy. You can modify the policies and so on. And you also get sample Eclipse projects for the demo application we just mentioned, the JSP PEP, which intercepts the request from the JSP front page, a standalone Java PEP, which also interacts with the same PDP, which is deployed on the same policy, which is deployed on the PP, and an alpha project, which you can just get to start with so that you can develop your own policies with an alpha if that's of interest to you. It also provides you with a ready-to-use policy administration point client workspace where we have policies that can be deployed at the PDP or policies that are imported from the alpha package. And all of this is implemented in a single Tomcat. So the single Tomcat contains an ASM, a PDP, and the demo application. And it also provides you with simplified initialization and management scripts, which makes life easier for you to start, stop, initialize the whole process, and so on. Now, what does the Developer Edition not contain? The key things are it doesn't give you the Eclipse distribution, so you have to install the Eclipse distribution if you are interested in using the projects or the alpha package. It doesn't give you, of course, the Java distribution again. So you have to install your Java from wherever you get it, from Oracle, for example, and you need to make sure it's up and running before you can use the package. And the main reason why we haven't included them is so that we kind of get away from the architecture and the OS dependencies which follow if you try to do that. And it doesn't include, for now at least, the APS developer resources, which is available as a separate download from our support web. In the future versions, we might be including them, but for now, it's not present. And anything else, of course, which is not mentioned in the previous slide or this slide as quick not being present. Now, since the main aim is to give the developers a very easy to use and easy to manage and initialize the package, you would expect a quick and easy to start guide, and this is what you will get. So you have about 3 main steps to follow for you to get this package up and running within a span of a couple of minutes, especially if you have the Java installed. So you install the Java SE, you copy the files into the folder which is specified. You change to the init directory which is in the distribution, and you run init.bat in the case of Windows, or if you're in Linux environment, you chmod the init.sh file and you run the file. That's it. You wait for some time. The initialization basically creates the ASM database for you, the policy administration, policy deployment point, the policy PDP, the policy decision point. It starts the Tomcat, it deploys the demo application and starts managing the PDP from the ASM and so on. So all this thing is done automatically with the initialization script. You don't have to download files separately and put it inside directories and make sure things work properly before you can start using the environment. And of course, you can verify the deployment by going to the URL specified and the credentials which are given to you. You can verify that you have one PDP, which is called group 1 in the PDP group, and you can try the demo application. So since showing is much better than talking about it, let's just dive into the demo and see what is available and what you can start using right now. So let me just switch to my virtual machine, which hopefully it doesn't take too long. Right, so just to make things simpler, and in the interest of time, I have already initialized, so I have a APS Developer Edition up and running, as simple as writing, copying the files into the license folder and executing the files required. And once you have that and you follow the link which was mentioned in the guide, you come to this landing page of the Tomcat server. So the obvious thing, of course, is the Tomcat manager, which is the typical manager which is used to manage any application on the Tomcat server container. And there are links to the Axiomatics Services Manager administrative panel and the links to the demo application. So let's just quickly go through each one of them. If you are not familiar with the ASM or haven't used it before, this will serve as a quick guide. But if you have used it before, then the idea is that I will show you that everything is up and running seamlessly. So just wait for the login to happen. So as you can see, what we provide are means for you to quickly get everything up and running. And the delay in logging in here is mainly because of my virtual machine, which is a bit too memory hungry. So hopefully it should get you up and running now. So the ASM has been loaded. So what you can see, the obvious thing is that there is a PDP group which has been created as part of the initialization process. So just give me a second and that should happen. So yeah, you have the PDP group 1, which is created as part of the initialization process, and you have one PDP which is already deployed and a part of the group 1. And this is the PDP that you can start working against. So if you look at the PDP list, this is the PDP 1 that we are talking about, and it's in operational state. And if you go back to the PDP group and to the group 1, let's just double click that. You'll see that there is a policy which has been deployed for that PDP group. So what it does is that when the policy is deployed into the group, the PDPs which form part of this group pull these policies and deploy it onto themselves. So let's just take a look at what exactly the policy does for you. So let me just go back to the landing page and let's go back to the demo application. So it's a very simple JSP page, and it's a very simple policy which has been deployed. The main idea is not to show you the power of XACML or the power of all the things that our products can do, but rather it is to give you a quick and dirty introduction to policy writing, to writing PEPs and so on. So for the example that we have, we basically have a policy which says, if your role is a manager, and if your location is specified as Sweden, you are allowed access. So you get back a permit response from the XACML PDP. So let's just take a quick test ride on it. Let's go for a negative first. So let's say you're a manager and your location is the US. And you click on the submit button and hopefully quickly enough, you should get back a response saying deny. Now, what happens is that because you're a manager but your location is the US, you get back a deny because only Swedish managers are allowed access. Let's just quickly go back and change that to an employee of the US. Again, you get back a deny. Let's go for an affirmative, and you change that to Sweden, and you get back a permit response. So what this shows is that you have a PDP which is up and running, which is intercepting, and the PEP which is up and running. The PEP intercepts the request from the JSP page, sends it off to the PDP, gets back a response from the PDP which has a symbol policy enabled, and it shows it as a part of the response. So let's quickly go through the JSP page and the JSP PEP that we have packaged as a part of the distribution. So as we mentioned, there are 4 Eclipse projects which you get when you get the Developer Edition package. So the first, of course, is let me just go to the index.jsp page, which is the JSP page you just saw. So it is gives you an idea of what you just saw. Basically, it's a post request. It is requesting for response.jsp, and in this case, you can choose between the manager, employee roles, and the US and the Swedish roles. And what happens there is that if you look at response.jsp, is that when a response is requested, the JSP PEP intercepts this request and sends it off to the PDP. Now let's just quickly take a look at the JSP PEP. It provides an implementation of a PEP which creates a connection to the PDP, creates the attributes from the request which was sent, sends it off to the PDP, gets back a response, and sends it off based on the response, decides what to do. So that is the JSP demo app and the JSP PEP which was demonstrated. You can also see that there is a standalone sample PEP which is a standalone Java application which works against the same deployed PDP. So if you're not interested in writing web-based applications or protecting web-based applications, you have a standalone PEP that you want to define. You can start using from the sample PEP project that's given to you. Let's just quickly take it for a run, right? So let's say you run it as a Java application. You will see that for now what you're doing is that it's connecting to the PDP with the things from the settings from the property directory file which defines what are the connection properties that you need to use, and it sends the specific XACML request and it gets the XACML response. Now the whole idea behind this demo was to show that the sample PEP, once you run within the Eclipse environment, is up and running and ready to go against the sample XACML policy which have been deployed onto the PDP, which is packaged as part of this distribution. So what you have are JSP PEPs and a sample demo application PEPs that can work out of the box. And then you also have the alpha package which has been used to write a sample policy, which is exactly the policy which we have defined in the PDP. If you're a manager, if you have a location of Sweden, you allow access, so that's the permit thing, and the apply is deny unless permit. And of course, you can define extra attributes in alpha from the alpha attributes file. So to understand more about how to use alpha, you always have the reference users guide that is packaged as part of the distribution also. For that matter, for any of the components they have their own application user guide as well as guides which will help you to understand how to use these tools in a more involved manner if that's needed for you. Now, so that is the Eclipse project which was packaged as a part of distribution. And just to go through the last aspect is this would be the PAP, the Policy Administration Point client, where you can compose your policies. So what you see here is the demo app workspace, which is the one which is packaged as part of the distribution. It contains basically 2 policies. One which was written in the PAP itself and which is which is then deployed onto the ASM and the PDP after that. And the other one is the policy which is imported from the alpha package. So the idea is just to give you show you that both the policies which are here are doing exactly the same things, but it is written one using a PAP client, the other using alpha package. You can use either of them to start working on things. You can also use the PAP client to simulate your policy against the already deployed PDP or an internal PDP. All this information are present in the user's guide that is part of the package, the APS Developer Edition user's guide. And you also have a set of tutorials, a series of tutorials which you can get from our support web, which are closely aligned with the demo application that we have. So the idea behind the tutorial is if you are new to using our products, you can quickly use those tutorials to get a handle on the basic things that can be done with our products, and you can then use the user's guide to go into the next steps of using it in a much powerful way. So that gets me to the end of the demonstration also, and with that in mind, maybe I can hand it back to Finn for him to go to the next part of the webinar. Finn, all yours.
Hey, thank you, Sridhar. Yes, thank you for a very interesting presentation. And that was a lot of grounds that you've covered here, both with the initial presentation and then the demo. So we have some interesting questions from the audience that I think perhaps we can touch upon directly. So first thing here, with regard to sort of the scope of where we do this, so the question reads, any thoughts on applying XACML to areas outside of web applications? So what you showed were your demo applications were all web applications. So what about a home router, a network architecture, VPN rules, and the like? So can you say something about the scope of applicability for this?
Thanks for the question, and thanks to Finn for bringing it up. Yes, the demo that we have shown is a web application. That's just a choice we made as an example. But you could basically protect most kinds of accesses where you have to decide based on a set of rules, and that can be expressed hopefully in terms of attributes. And XACML comes into play in all these situations, and using the PEP the kind of PEP that you need to use at those points depend, of course, on the environment and the framework that you're working with, and of course the resource you're trying to protect. But of course, unlike it can be XACML as a standard, and the PEP samples that we have provided can be used for writing any kinds of PEPs. We have an SDK which is Java as well as .NET based also.
Okay. Yes. So and that actually brings me to another related question then. Well, I think it is related to a certain extent. So you talked about programmatic and declarative sort of patterns. Mm-hmm. So what are people doing? Is it common for programmers to include PEPs in their code, or do you usually see that access requests are captured on the gateway level or something like that?
We see a mixture, actually. So companies which have used, say, for example, XML gateway or other kinds of gateways have moved away from using the programmatic way of doing things, where you write the whole concept, the rules and policies within the code, and you externalized to an XML gateway or whatever. But we also see people doing both sides of the things, and we cannot say one is better than the other, but the whole idea is that however you approach the problem, if you want to take care of future-proofing the whole process and to make it something that can be easy to maintain, so something which can be doesn't have to rewrite the whole code of an application just because something changed within the logic of your role or so your business side of things change, it's best to externalize them. And if you externalize them, you get the benefits of that, and that's the programmatic methodology we are trying to push towards.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah. But would you agree, though? Sorry for so I'm interfering with the questions now. Would you agree that if we, for instance, have a PEP placed in a gateway in front of the application, so this would be then in that sense a declarative method, right? Fall into that category rather, because then I don't really need to change the code of my application, right? Yeah. So, and that is fully doable. We can have a PEP in a gateway. We could have it on the web server. You mentioned that, and what have you. So, okay. So, but the problem, of course, with the current implementation of a declarative way of implementing authorization is still that, you don't put it in the code, but you still capture it within your properties file, XML files, and it's basically still revolves around the concept of roles. Mm-hmm. But if you externalize that from your container security environment or your implementation, you get the benefit of having richer attribute-based rules, and also making it easier to not have to rewrite the rules within your application server container settings. Right. How about aspect-oriented programming? How would that relate to these different patterns? You can also use aspect-oriented programming as a mechanism to do that, and it is, well, from what I have seen, it's less often used, but it is equally powerful, and it's just another way of doing it, and you can externalize aspect-oriented programming methodology for authorization also. Okay, good. So we have some other less technical questions. Mm-hmm. So first of all, you've addressed the low-level application issues with externalizing authorization. What other preparations, perhaps non-technical, would you recommend an organization undertakes? So when you're moving towards ABAC or XACML-based address. Yes. Okay. So it is actually a very good question that you brought up, because it's a very good context behind this also, is that recently NIST had come up with a definition of what ABAC systems are and a guidance document on what to consider if you want to move towards an ABAC system. So those who haven't read it, it's a good read. It gives you an idea of what ABAC is, which we have hoped to capture here, but also things about the whole, from a business point of view and from a technical point of view, what needs to be considered. So one of the core things that people, that comes up is the fact that, right, so you have rules, and rules depend on attributes, so you need to be careful when you have attributes defined. You need to, in two contexts, think about it. You need to be able to capture all the attributes that makes the decision about a certain access, and also you need to be careful about allowing these attributes, managing these attributes. You should not be able to willy-nilly be able to use attributes that are maybe of not context specific, or more problematically would be things which can undermine the security of your role. So you need to be careful about how you define attributes, and how you use them, and what places you look up to get your attributes and so on. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to capture all these points within just the webinar question, but those who are interested can go through the NIST guidance document or get back to us. We would be able to happily help you with getting into the details of these higher level picture. Yeah, right. And actually, Sridhar, there are two documents on that Axiomatics that can provide that relate to this. I think on the one hand, we have the white paper on how to use ABAC that takes sort of the high level view to this. And mm-hmm. we also have a document on sort of impact analysis on when you start planning for ABAC that takes sort of the business aspects into consideration. So we'll put links. All of these questions will be, and the answers will be available with the publishing of the slides afterwards, and we'll put links in there to those documents, I think, for those of you who asked this. So we're coming close to the end of this webinar, but I think we have time for a few more questions. So another one that may entail both technical and non-technical aspects is this. So are there best practices for embedding fine-grained resource references within application code? Does the application code use static strings to represent non-URL resources? Does the PEP support a method to return collections of its resource definitions? So this was a number of questions in one. Should we start with the first one? With the
and you can also help me along the lines to answer some of them. Yep.
Yes. So with the static strings, if we start there, what are the types that we can play around with there?
So what is the question again? Within the context of a PEP or within the context of a XACML policy?
No, within the application code, the PEP. So does the application code use static strings to represent the resources, or so it's basically the data types of the attributes? Yes.
So yeah, I mean, it depends upon the attribute type that is defined. So you could have strings, integers, and so on. So when you define your attribute, you define the attribute type, and that is useful when you're so XACML as a standard has a set of attributes, and each of these attributes has an attribute type. Some of them are strings, some of them are integers, and you can use your own SDKs which are provided by a XACML vendor to write your own attribute definitions and then set your own types, and that can be used within the SDK as long as you have defined it properly.
Yeah. And I think the standard comes with pretty nifty things like X509 500 names. Yeah, or no, the name definition in the attributes, so you can use sort of the organizational unit part of a LDAP. Identity.
Yeah, and it also has support for things like content, which is basically an XML document blob, which can be then used with a XPath references. So you have a lot of choices on how do you
Now, the latter part of this question, though, from one of our attendees, hits, I would say, Sridhar, a weak point in XACML. So this was the question again. Does the PEP support a method to return collections of its resource definitions? So I have a long list of things. Let's say there are 5,000 things out there. I may see 4 of them. Do I then, how do I get to those 4 of the 5,000? Can you expand on that a bit, what you can do with XACML and where you need to go beyond sort of?
So XACML as a standard or as a reference architecture, or the way things implemented, it doesn't directly help you with it. But then you can use tools for, in our case, Axiomatics tools, which can query and filter out the results. So you could basically say, okay, I have a constraint that I want to put in my request. With these constraints, what are the things which are available to me? So you could say, my username is Sridhar. And if that is the case, what are the activities I can do on what are the resources? So you could use that to do that kind of a before the fact audit, if you want to put it that way. We have an Axiomatics Policy Auditor and an Axiomatics Reverse Query as products which you can use in conjunction with it. But of course, that doesn't directly reference the XACML specification of the standard, because all that it does is talk about rules and how you can define your resources, but you need to use tools on top of that to get to what you want.
True, yeah. But I'd say that there is, though, indeed in the standard, one thing, namely with the profile for the multi-decision profile, right? Because that allows us to a certain extent to say, okay, I have not asked one question and get permit deny, and then the next permit deny, but I could ask a whole bunch of questions, right? And
right.
Yeah, and then I get back sort of a list of permit, deny, document 14, permit, document 15, deny, and so on. However, that I guess, Sridhar, will not scale endlessly. There's an upper limit with a multi-decision profile, and beyond that is what you're saying. Then you need to go into these special tools.
Indeed. Yeah. So Finn brought out a quick, interesting thing which we didn't talk about in the XACML introduction is the concept of profiles, which helps kind of normalize the way things can be, XACML can be used in specific contexts. So multiple decision profile is one of them. Then you have the JSON profile, which can be used to define how to use JSON as a mechanism and so on. So, and then you have the PCI profile, I think. Similar profiles which can be used.
Okay, yeah. So, Sridhar, I'm looking at this very long list of very interesting questions that we're getting, and I'm getting a bit nervous because now the time is out. So I think actually we'll stop here. I will answer a couple of questions that we received, namely, how do we get to the presentation? How can we view this again? Now, this will be published on the Axiomatics website, www.axiomatics.com, and together with the presentation, the webinar, the recording of the webinar will be made available, and will there also publish questions and answers completely. So all the things that we've discussed here, plus to those of you who had questions which we haven't touched upon yet, interesting questions on the cloud, interesting questions on delegation of permissions and the like. We'll do that in writing, and you can revisit this later on then. I think that's the best we can do for now. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll be in touch with you via our questions and answers on the website then. Okay?
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.